My name is Charlotte Hayes. I am 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I believed family meant love, sacrifice, and standing by one another. I worked double shifts, saved every dollar, and told myself one day my parents would see how hard I fought to build a life on my own. But the night they gathered us around the old dining table, the same table where I once did homework under my father's watchful eye, all of that shattered. My father leaned forward, his voice cold, and told me unless I handed over $50,000 for my younger sister's wedding, I would no longer be their daughter. In that moment, decades of sacrifice turned into a cruel revelation. That to them, I was never a daughter at all, only a wallet, only an ATM with a heartbeat. And the silence of that room told me no one would come to my defense. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. 9. The smell of roast chicken and rosemary filled my parents' dining room that night, but the warmth of the food did nothing to ease the cold knot tightening in my stomach. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, polished to a shine, and lit by the yellow glow of the chandelier overhead. My hands clenched in my lap as I watched the silence stretch every second, dragging me closer to the ultimatum I already knew was coming. My mother, Margaret, hovered at his side, smoothing the tablecloth with nervous fingers. Her voice, when she spoke, carried that practiced softness that always came before a hard blow. "Charlotte, honey," she said, "you know this family has always prided itself on standing together, especially in moments that matter." Rebecca sat 2 seats down from them, a tissue clutched in her hand, eyes already glistening as if she had rehearsed this scene. At 32, she had perfected the role of the fragile younger daughter. Beside her was Daniel, her fiancé. His shoulders hunched, gaze fixed on his plate as though the floral pattern was more important than what was about to be said. His hands trembled slightly, fingers tapping against his fork, betraying the tension he didn't dare voice. I tried to steady my breathing to ground myself in something familiar. The scratch of the napkin against my palms, the muted tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. But the room's silence pressed down, heavy, suffocating. My chest tightened, and my pulse thudded in my ears. I knew something was coming, something big. Richard cleared his throat, sharp and deliberate, the sound ricocheting off the walls. "We are here tonight," he began, his voice deep and commanding, "because our family is approaching an important milestone." He glanced at Rebecca, then at me, as though weighing which of us carried more value in that moment. "Your sister's wedding is not just a personal event. It is a statement about who we are, what we represent in this community." I forced myself to nod politely, though my stomach twisted. I thought perhaps they wanted to discuss seating charts or flowers or schedules, but the tone in my father's voice was too heavy for that. Margaret leaned forward, her hands folded as if in prayer. "We've gone over the numbers, Charlotte. A wedding is costly, as you know, and Rebecca deserves a day that reflects her worth. The total will come to about $50,000. For a second, I thought I had misheard. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice catching. "What do you mean?" Richard's eyes locked onto mine, sharp and unblinking. "It means, Charlotte, that you are in the best position to take this on. You have your practice in Seattle. Steady clients, no husband, no children to support. You can manage this better than anyone else." Rebecca sniffled right on cue, dabbing her eyes. "I just want a proper wedding, Charlotte," she whispered. "I don't want to be embarrassed in front of our friends and relatives." Daniel reached for her hand, his eyes still on the plate, jaw tight as if he wanted to vanish. My mother leaned in, her voice dripping with sugar. "Sweetheart, you are single, you have no burdens. Rebecca has responsibilities, 2 children to think of. Families lift each other up. Isn't that what we always taught you?" I gripped the edge of the table, forcing my hands to stay steady. My throat felt dry. "That isn't fair," I said, keeping my tone calm, though anger pricked at my chest. Richard's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Fairness," he said, "is about sacrifice. If you cannot do this, then maybe you are not truly part of this family anymore." The words sliced through me like glass. The chandelier light seemed harsher. Rebecca's muffled sobs sharper, the air thicker. For years I had worked late nights, saved every penny, dreamed of owning my own condo, where I could finally hang pictures without asking a landlord's permission. I had carried that dream like a secret flame, and here they were demanding I burn it down for one night of flowers, food, and a rented ballroom. Rebecca dabbed her eyes again, her voice trembling. You've always had everything together. Perfect grades, perfect job. You don't know what it's like to struggle. I wanted to laugh, but the ache in my chest stopped me. I looked at Daniel. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, but he said nothing, his silence louder than any defense. I stared at my parents. My mother's eyes wet with rehearsed sympathy, my father's expression carved from stone. Every memory of loyalty, every sacrifice, every moment I thought they might finally see me, all of it collapsed into the crushing realization that to them I was a bank account with a face. The silence stretched unbearably. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven. I stood slowly, my chair scraping across the hardwood. My mother gasped softly. Rebecca clutched Daniel's arm as though I were a threat. Richard's eyes followed me, hard and unyielding. His voice rose thunderous in the still room. He slammed his hand against the table, the dishes rattling. Enough. If you refuse, then hear me clearly. You are no daughter of mine. You will be banned from this family. Banned from your sister's wedding. Banned forever. The words echoed, final and absolute. The chandelier swayed faintly above us, and for a moment the house that had once been my anchor felt like a cage closing in. I looked at each of them, my father's cold certainty, my mother's calculated tears, my sister's theatrics, my brother-in-law's silence, and knew the ground beneath us had shifted. Nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply stood there, my hands trembling at my sides. My breath caught in my throat and let the weight of their ultimatum settle over me like a stone. I drove back to my apartment that night with my father's words still ringing in my ears, each one like a nail sealing a box around me. By the time I pushed open the door and dropped my keys on the counter, my body felt heavy, like every muscle remembered the weight of being the responsible one. I collapsed onto the couch without even turning on the lights. In the silence, old memories rose like ghosts I hadn't invited. I saw myself at 16 standing behind the register of a small grocery store in North Seattle, my feet aching from hours on the linoleum floor. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and I counted the minutes until closing. My hands were red from bagging groceries, my back stiff from stocking shelves, but I never complained. Every dollar I made went into a mason jar hidden in my closet because I knew if my parents found it, they'd tell me Rebecca needed it more. I worked weekends too, pouring coffee at a diner off Aurora Avenue. The smell of bacon grease clung to my clothes and my fingers were raw from scrubbing counters. I remember calculating tips down to the penny, sliding the crumpled bills into an envelope I guarded like treasure. That money bought me my first car, a rusty old Toyota Corolla that coughed and sputtered but carried me to school and work. When it finally died on the side of I-5 2 years later, I stood there in the rain, staring at the smoke curling from the hood, knowing no one was coming to rescue me. I scraped together enough to buy another used car. Rebecca was still in high school then. When she wrecked her second hand-me-down, my parents shook their heads and bought her a third. She's still learning, they said, smiling at her as if reckless mistakes were just stepping stones. For me, there was no such safety net. Mistakes weren't allowed. The memory bled into another. I was 19, a freshman at the University of Washington, juggling classes and shifts at the campus library. I ate instant noodles in my dorm room, hunched over textbooks until my eyes blurred. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. On nights when the library closed, I walked across Red Square under the dark Seattle sky, clutching my backpack and wondering how much longer I could stretch the $20 bill in my wallet. Meanwhile, Rebecca posted photos from frat parties, grinning with a red cup in hand. She lasted 1 semester at a private college in California before flunking out and coming home. My parents wrote off the $15,000 they'd spent without a word of reproach. It wasn't the right fit, they said, patting her hand. I clenched my jaw, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. The pattern of it seemed to swim in and out of focus. Every memory carried the same refrain. I worked harder. She stumbled. They caught her. I kept standing alone. And through it all, my parents had one word for me: lucky. Lucky you got a scholarship, my father would say, ignoring the nights I stayed up studying until dawn. Lucky you found a good job, my mother would sigh, never acknowledging the hours I spent cold calling clients to build my accounting practice from scratch. Lucky you don't need help. Rebecca would sneer as if independence was some gift dropped into my lap rather than something I clawed toward with bleeding fingers. I pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes, the pressure doing little to stem the sting. That word had followed me my whole life like a shadow that erased the shape of who I really was. Lucky. It was easier than admitting they had chosen her over me again and again. I remembered one Thanksgiving when Rebecca cried about bills piling up. She had been irresponsible, but the room swelled with sympathy. "She's trying her best," Margaret whispered, handing her an envelope of cash. I sat there quietly biting my tongue, though I knew Rebecca still owed me money I'd loaned her months earlier. When I tried to bring it up later, she burst into tears and called me cruel. My mother scolded me. "She has children, Charlotte. You don't—" The anger welled up again, now hot in my chest. Still, even through the bitterness, I remembered the small, persistent hope I used to carry. Maybe one day, I told myself, they'd notice. Maybe they'd realize the hours, the sacrifices, the quiet ways I kept everything from falling apart. Maybe they'd thank me. Maybe they'd say they were proud. But that day never came. Instead, tonight, they had looked me in the eye and told me my worth was measured in $50,000. Or nothing at all. I sat up slowly, wrapping a blanket around myself as though I could shield against the memories clawing at me. My apartment was silent, except for the distant rumble of traffic, but in my mind, I could still hear Rebecca's practiced sobs, my mother's sugar-coated guilt, my father's booming decree. Lucky. That word echoed until it hollowed me out. I leaned back against the couch cushions, staring into the dark, and whispered it once aloud, just to hear how it sounded without their voices wrapped around it. Lucky. My voice cracked, and a bitter laugh escaped me. No, not lucky. Just used. The tears came then, hot and unwanted. I pressed my face into the blanket, letting the sobs shake through me. For the first time in years, I didn't bother to stop them. When they finally ebbed, I sat in the stillness, my chest aching, my throat raw. I thought about that night at the grocery store, the endless library shifts, the rusted Corolla rattling down the highway. I thought about Rebecca stumbling home drunk from parties, being tucked back into the family's arms without consequence. The pattern was too clear now to ignore. They had never intended to see me. I had been the scaffolding invisible until it cracked. And now when I refused to carry the weight, they threatened to tear me down completely. I lay back, exhaustion pulling at me, the blanket pulled tight against my chin. My body trembled from the storm of memory and grief, but beneath it all, something colder, sharper, steadier was beginning to take root. They called me lucky because it was easier than admitting the truth. And the truth was this: I had built my life brick by brick alone. I had carried the burden they refused to shoulder. I had been strong, not lucky. That realization settled over me as I closed my eyes. The pain was still raw, but somewhere beneath it a flicker of resolve sparked. It was small, fragile, but alive. And for the first time that night, I knew that word, lucky, no longer belonged to me. It belonged to them for never having to stand on their own. The glow from the desk lamp spread in a small circle over the papers scattered across my table. My apartment felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made the sound of my own breath seem intrusive. I pulled open the bottom drawer, fingers brushing past old tax files and receipts until they found the familiar edge of a brown envelope. I hesitated for a moment, then slid it out and laid it on the desk as though it carried the weight of 100 bricks. The paper inside was crisp, the notary seal pressed in gold, Rebecca Hayes' signature looping, and hurried, dated March 2019. $30,000. I traced the numbers with my finger, the ink still sharp, almost mocking. The memory of that afternoon came rushing back. Rebecca had shown up at my office, her eyes red mascara smudged, clutching my hands so tightly it almost hurt. "Charlotte, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. She had even knelt by my chair, humiliating herself in a way that made me feel both powerful and trapped. "Just this once. Just one more chance. I swear if you believe in me, this boutique will prove everyone wrong." I had watched her cry, listened to her promise, heard her say she wanted to show Mom and Dad she could stand on her own. Against every instinct, I agreed. I walked her down to a small notary office on Pine Street, where a woman in glasses stamped the document and slid it across the desk. Rebecca hugged me afterward, tears of gratitude wetting my shoulder. "You won't regret this," she said, voice trembling. "I'll pay you back in full. Every cent." The words still echoed in my head, brittle and hollow now. Within months, the boutique lights went dark. The shelves were bare, the rent unpaid, the promises gone. When I asked her about it, she shrugged her excuses, tumbling one after another. The pandemic killed small businesses. Daniel lost his job. The kids needed new clothes for school. There was always a reason, always a way to shift the weight. The first Christmas after the store closed, I asked gently about repayment. She burst into tears at the dinner table, clutching her son Tyler against her chest like I had just attacked her. "You're cruel," she sobbed. "How could you even bring this up when you know I'm struggling? You don't have children. You don't understand." My mother shot me a warning look as if I had committed a crime by speaking. My father changed the subject. Rebecca sniffled, and the conversation carried on as though my $30,000 had never existed. It wasn't the only time. Each attempt to raise the subject ended the same way. With her tears and accusations, my mother's disappointed sigh, my father's silence. "She has responsibilities," Margaret would remind me. "You don't." I leaned back in my chair, now staring at the document under the lamplight. It was more than just paper. It was proof. Proof that I had given, that I had sacrificed, that I had been there when she asked. Proof that I wasn't heartless, that I wasn't the selfish caricature they painted me to be. And yet, when I thought of the conversations at the dining table, the looks that passed between them all, I felt was bitterness. They had erased this act from their memories, tucked it away like it never happened. My hands shook slightly as I picked up the paper, holding it up so the lamplight caught the seal. The reflection glinted harsh and cold, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Anger at Rebecca's manipulation, sorrow at my parents' blindness, but also something steadier, sharper. Vindication. I remembered the night she begged for the money, the way her voice cracked when she promised to repay me. I remembered her exact words. "You won't regret this." And yet here I was, 5 years later, staring at a debt she had never even attempted to acknowledge. The apartment seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing close with the weight of unspoken truths. I thought of the countless hours I had poured into my business, the clients I had won one by one, the sacrifices I had made to build a future. And in contrast, I saw Rebecca collapsing under the smallest burdens, always cushioned by my parents' sympathy, always absolved. I pressed the paper flat against the desk, my palm firm, grounding myself in the reality of it. I whispered into the empty room, my voice rough. "At least I'm not crazy." The words sounded strange, foreign, but necessary, because for years they had made me doubt myself. For years I had wondered if maybe I was too harsh, too rigid, too unwilling to bend. But this document was a reminder I wasn't imagining the imbalance. I wasn't cruel for expecting accountability. The anger drained slowly, leaving behind a cold steadiness. I slid the paper back into its envelope, pressing the flap closed, as though sealing away the years of lies and excuses. My fingers lingered on it, the cardboard warm beneath my hand. Outside my window, the city hummed, distant traffic, the faint wail of a siren, the rhythm of life carrying on. Inside, I sat alone with the truth raw and undeniable. $30,000, signed and sealed. I turned off the lamp, the room falling into shadow, the envelope still lying in front of me. In the darkness, the gold seal glimmered faintly like an ember that refused to die. And as I stared at it, a thought settled deep into my bones. They could twist the story however they wanted, but I had this. I had proof. I exhaled slowly, resting my forehead against the cool wood of the desk. The ache in my chest eased just enough for me to breathe. At least I knew the truth. At least I wasn't alone in it anymore. The morning after, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee, trying to lose myself in the quiet hum of the city outside my window. My phone buzzed, and, out of habit, I picked it up. The screen lit with a notification from Facebook, Rebecca's profile picture right there at the top of my feed. Her words cut through me before I even finished reading them. Some people are blessed with money but cursed with selfish hearts. Below it was a photo of Tyler and Emma in their school uniforms, smiling, their innocence turned into a weapon. My chest tightened. The comments were already piling up. Aunts, cousins, women from our church, all chiming in with sympathy for her. Stay strong, Rebecca. You deserve this day. It's shameful when family forgets what family means. Each word was a blow, another voice joining the chorus that painted me as the villain. My phone buzzed again, then again. A flood of notifications scrolled across the screen, the numbers climbing faster than I could read them. My throat ached. It was one thing to be attacked at the dinner table behind closed doors. It was another to be dragged out into the open, my character stripped down and displayed for the community to judge. Then my phone rang. Aunt Evelyn's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring, but she called again. Reluctantly, I answered. Her voice came sharp, each word like a lash. Charlotte, what are you doing? Do you want to disgrace this family? Everyone is talking about it. You're making your parents look like fools. You're making Rebecca look abandoned. I swallowed hard, pressing the phone tighter to my ear. Aunt Evelyn, you don't know the whole story. I know enough, she snapped. Your sister is on the verge of losing everything, and you sit there with your money and your pride. Do you want us all to be humiliated at that wedding? Her words rushed over me, suffocating. I hung up before the tears came, but my hands trembled as I set the phone down. I tried to focus on work, opening my laptop, staring at spreadsheets and invoices, but every few seconds, the notifications pinged. Messages poured in from cousins I barely spoke to, old neighbors, even people I hadn't seen since high school. Some were guilt-laden pleas, others were sharp, cruel accusations. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the post again, reading every comment until my stomach churned. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed out a response, shaking with anger. You don't know the truth. I've given more than you realize. Rebecca still owes me $30,000 signed and notarized. For a brief moment, I felt the rush of release, the satisfaction of finally speaking out. But the replies came fast. Lies. How dare you air family business online? So what if she owes you? She has children. You don't. The backlash slammed into me harder than the silence ever had. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse hammering. I pressed my palms against my face, trying to block out the echo of their words. My living room, once a refuge, now felt like a cage closing in. I could almost hear the voices of the church ladies whispering in the pews, shaking their heads. I could picture my parents reading Rebecca's post, their disappointment sharpening into certainty that I was the selfish one. The phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Rebecca herself. I didn't want to do this, Charlotte, but you left me no choice. People need to know how heartless you've become. I gritted my teeth, staring at the words. My fingers itched to reply, to unleash the truth I had tucked away in that envelope. But I stopped. She wanted this fight out in the open, in the court of public opinion, where tears and sympathy outweighed evidence. I stood and paced the length of my apartment, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. Outside, traffic rumbled down the street. Ordinary life, carrying on as mine, unraveled in front of everyone I had ever known. I sat back down, staring at my silent phone. It wasn't enough that they had threatened me in private. Now Rebecca had pulled the community into it, twisting them into her shield, her weapon. The realization settled heavy in my chest, colder than any accusation my parents had thrown at me. She wasn't just fighting me inside the family anymore. She had turned the world outside against me too. Rain pattered softly against the window pane as I stepped into my parents' house again, the familiar creak of the floorboards echoing under my feet. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and pot roast, but the warmth I once associated with that scent had long since drained away. Tonight it felt heavy, like walking into a courtroom where the verdict was already decided. Richard sat at the head of the dining table posture, straight hands folded as if bracing himself. Margaret stood behind him, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that seemed more like a prop than a necessity. Rebecca perched on the couch with Tyler and Emma pressed against her sides. Their little faces turned toward me wide-eyed, and unsure their innocence pulled into a storm they didn't understand. I closed the door quietly, shaking the rain from my jacket. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice, even though my pulse thundered. Richard gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit. We need to settle this." I stayed standing for a moment, weighing whether I even wanted to hear what I already knew was coming. Finally, I pulled out the chair and sat the wood cold under me. Rebecca sniffled loudly, pressing a kiss into Emma's hair. "Rebecca, do you want to tell them?" She said, her eyes glistening with practiced sorrow, that you don't love your niece and nephew enough to help them have one happy memory of their mom's wedding. "Do you want to break their hearts, Charlotte?" My stomach tightened. Tyler's gaze flicked to me, confusion clouding his young face. Emma clung to her mother's arm, lips trembling. They didn't understand the words, only the tension hanging thick in the room. I leaned forward, my palms flat on the table. "Don't you dare use them against me, Rebecca." Margaret gasped softly, stepping closer. "Charlotte, sweetheart, no one is against you. But Rebecca has children. Don't you remember what it was like to be young, to hope for something beautiful?" I felt my teeth press into each other, my patience fraying. "She owes me $30,000, I said, my voice low, controlled. "Signed, notarized. She promised to pay me back, and she never has." The words dropped like stones into a still pond. Silence rippled out across the room. Even the rain against the windows seemed to pause. Rebecca's face flushed, tears spilling faster now. She clutched Emma tighter, rocking slightly. "How could you bring that up here?" she cried, her voice climbing into a wail. "That was between sisters. You don't drag that out in front of Mom and Dad. That's cruel." Richard's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. He didn't meet my eyes, but the muscle in his cheek twitched. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Tyler shifted uncomfortably, looking between us, sensing more than he understood. I steadied my breathing, forcing myself not to rise to Rebecca's theatrics. "You asked me to believe in you," I said quietly. "You promised to repay me. And I did believe in you. But now you expect me to erase that debt and hand over $50,000 more for one night, for flowers and photographs." Rebecca's sobs grew louder, filling the space. "You've always thought you were better than me," she spat through her tears. "Perfect Charlotte with her perfect job, her perfect life. You don't know what it's like to struggle." I almost laughed, but the sound lodged in my throat, bitter. I worked 3 jobs in high school to buy my first car. I took loans, ate ramen, studied until dawn. Don't you dare tell me I don't know what struggle is. The silence after my words was sharp, cutting through Rebecca's performance. Margaret dabbed her eyes, whispering something under her breath that I couldn't make out. Richard shifted in his chair, his gaze finally lifting to meet mine. For a flicker of a second, I thought I saw doubt in his eyes. Rebecca's voice cracked shrill, now desperate. "You are heartless. This isn't about money. It's about family. And you'll never understand that." My hands clenched into fists under the table. Every nerve in my body screamed to shout back, to hurl every injustice I had swallowed for years. But I forced myself still. The rain tapped harder against the glass, a relentless reminder of the storm pressing in from every side. I looked at Tyler and Emma again. Emma's small hand gripped her mother's sleeve so tightly her knuckles were white. Tyler's eyes glistened uncertain as if waiting for someone to tell him the truth. My chest ached at the sight of them caught in the middle of their mother's lies. Rebecca's accusation still rang in the air, heartless. Between sisters. Not to be spoken aloud. I rose slowly from the table, pushing the chair back with a screech against the hardwood. The sound made everyone flinch. My voice was calm, even though I could feel the fire burning in my chest. If telling the truth makes me heartless, I said, my eyes fixed on Rebecca, then maybe I've been too kind for too long. No one spoke. The rain pounded harder, wind rattling the old windows, and the silence inside the house grew heavier than the storm outside. The rain had eased into a mist by the time I pulled into Tacoma, the streets glistening under the glow of street lamps. I parked outside a small coffee shop tucked between a hardware store and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that looked almost forgotten by time. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of roasted beans and cinnamon. Golden light spilled across wooden tables, and only a handful of customers sat scattered quietly with their laptops and mugs. Michael Carter spotted me before I had even stepped fully inside. He stood from a corner booth, giving a small, hesitant wave. His resemblance to Daniel was undeniable, the same height, the same sharp jawline. But where Daniel's eyes often looked clouded, Michael's were sharp, steady, though heavy with something unsaid. "Charlotte," he said as I approached, his tone polite but weighted. "Thanks for meeting me." I slid into the booth across from him. "You said it was important," I replied, folding my hands on the table to keep them from trembling. A waitress brought him a refill of black coffee and set a mug in front of me after I nodded. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic, grateful for the heat. Michael didn't waste time. He leaned forward, his voice low. "You deserve to know the truth about my brother." I felt my heart give a painful thud. "Go on." Michael exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Daniel hasn't had a steady job in nearly 2 years. He tells people he's consulting, but that's a lie. He's been living off credit cards, maxing them out one after another." My stomach dropped. The pieces began sliding into place, each one sharp enough to cut. "So that's why he never looks me in the eye?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. Michael nodded grimly. "There's more. He's been spending a lot of time at Emerald Pines Casino out on the edge of town. Too much time. He's gotten himself into trouble there." I stared at him, the words striking like blows. The casino. The long nights he disappeared. The way he avoided every direct question. How bad, I asked, my voice quieter now. Michael shook his head. "Worse than you think. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know he owes people. He's in deeper than he admits to Rebecca, maybe even to himself. But from what I've seen, it's more debt than you can imagine. And it's not just banks and cards. Some of the people he owes aren't the forgiving type." My pulse raced. Every muscle in my body felt tight, like a string pulled too far. The silence of Daniel at family dinners, the pale look on his face, the way his hands shook when Rebecca pushed him. It wasn't shame because he wanted to protect me. It was fear because he was hiding. Michael's eyes softened, though his jaw stayed tense. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you so you understand the pressure he's under. And why Rebecca is clinging so hard to this wedding. She thinks if you cover the cost, she can use the money to patch holes you don't even know exist." The mug in my hands felt heavy, too hot. I set it down before I dropped it. "So all of this," I said slowly, "the crying, the guilt trips dragging my parents into it. It's not just about the wedding. It's about covering his mess." Michael's silence was answer enough. I leaned back, pressing a hand to my forehead. The coffee shop noises. Milk steaming chairs, scraping a barista laughing softly. Blurred into static. My thoughts tumbled over one another, memories shifting into a new, uglier light. Rebecca's desperation. Daniel's silence. My parents' blind insistence that I could and should fix everything. None of it was random. It was a script written on the back of his debts, his recklessness, her complicity. I should have known, I muttered, bitterness clawing at my throat. The way he just sat there while she begged me. He didn't defend her, he didn't defend himself. He just waited. Michael's expression was pained, as if he carried some of the shame himself. I've covered for him before, he admitted quietly. When collectors came asking, I paid just enough to make them go away. But I can't keep doing it. And Rebecca, she's not helping him. She's enabling him. You're the only one strong enough to say no. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Strong enough or stubborn enough to be the villain in everyone's story. Michael studied me, then shook his head. No, strong enough to see it for what it is. But you need to be careful, because this is going to come out whether you want it to or not. And when it does, it's going to tear everything open. His words hung heavy between us, louder than the clink of cups or the low hum of conversation. I stared into my coffee, watching the ripples settle after I tapped the spoon against the side. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. How long do you think he has before it all blows up? I asked finally. Michael's eyes met mine, steady and grave. Not long. The truth has a way of surfacing, and when it does, Charlotte, you'd better be ready. Because it won't be quiet. The words landed like a gavel. I sat frozen, my fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor me against the storm I suddenly knew was inevitable. The church bells had just finished their echo when we spilled out into the courtyard, the congregation breaking into smaller knots of conversation. The damp chill of a Seattle Sunday clung to the air, but the sun tried to break through, casting sharp streaks of light across the stone steps. I had barely made it past the front doors when Margaret's hand tightened around my arm. "Charlotte," she said with that familiar sweetness that always came before something sharp, "come with me." She led me toward a circle of women from the church, women I had known most of my life. They stood in their coats and scarves, clutching their hymnals, whispering among themselves, until Margaret inserted me like a defendant into their jury. "My daughter," she began, her voice carrying just enough to draw everyone closer, "has always been very independent. But sometimes independence turns into selfishness." She paused, tilting her head, her eyes sliding toward me before drifting back to the crowd. "Not like Rebecca. Rebecca has sacrificed so much for her children. She gives without question." A murmur rippled through the group. I caught snippets. Such a shame poor Rebecca. Charlotte should know better. Their eyes flicked to me, some pitying, most disapproving. It felt like the walls of the church itself were closing in, painted with their judgment. I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists inside my coat pockets. Heat rushed to my face, not from shame, but from anger. I opened my mouth, ready to fire back, to call out every lie, every imbalance, every time I had been expected to clean up Rebecca's chaos while being called lucky. But then I caught myself. I could feel the trap tightening. No matter what I said, they would hear it as bitterness. I turned, slightly ready to walk away. Charlotte Margaret's voice rang behind me, soft and heavy with meaning. "Do you think family isn't worth sacrifice?" The group shifted closer, like spectators waiting for a blow. My throat tightened. I swallowed down the words rising in me, knowing if I spoke now they would feast on them like breadcrumbs scattered in a storm. And then from behind a voice cut through the air, clear and steady. "I've seen enough sacrifice to know who's been giving," said Mrs. Thompson. The women turned, startled. She stood tall despite her 68 years, her gray hair pinned neatly, her church coat buttoned against the chill. Her eyes, sharp as glass, swept over the circle before landing squarely on Margaret. "I've lived next door to the Hayes family for decades," she continued. "I've watched Charlotte work herself to the bone since she was a teenager. She paid for her own schooling, her own car every step of her way. I've also seen Rebecca spend freely, run through Carr's college's businesses. And every time the family swoops in to save her," the murmurs stopped. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind pushing through the trees. Mrs. Thompson's voice hardened. "If you all think it's right to condemn Charlotte, the one who has carried her own weight and more, then shame on you. If this family decides to cast her out, that shame will belong to them, not her." Silence descended thick and absolute. The judgmental eyes dropped to the pavement to their hymnals to anywhere but me. Margaret's face flushed crimson, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. She looked at me, then quickly away, as if Mrs. Thompson's words had stripped her of the script she'd been rehearsing. I stood frozen, the chill of the air biting through my coat, but inside me, something shifted. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't the only voice speaking my truth. Someone else had seen, someone else had said it out loud. The quiet stretched on, and in that moment, with the courtyard still and Margaret's face burning, I felt a spark of something I hadn't allowed myself in years: vindication. The living room was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. The chandelier overhead gave off a cold light, casting sharp reflections on the polished wood of the coffee table. I stood just inside the doorway, the envelope clutched tightly in my hand. My parents, Rebecca and Daniel, were already seated, their eyes lifting to me as though I carried the verdict in my purse. Without a word, I stepped forward and laid the envelope flat on the table. The sound of paper against wood was louder than it should have been. My fingers trembled only slightly as I slid the documents out and placed them where everyone could see. Richard leaned forward, his brows knitting as he reached for the papers. His hands, those hands that had once taught me how to ride a bike, steady and sure, now shook faintly as he turned the first page. He scanned the lines quickly, his mouth pressing into a tight line. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, her breath catching. "Charlotte," she gasped, her voice trembling. How could you do this to your sister?" My throat tightened. "How could I?" I said, my voice sharp. "She borrowed $30,000 from me, Mom. Signed, notarized. She promised she would pay me back. And she hasn't given me a single cent." Rebecca shot up from her chair, her eyes wild tears streaming down her face. "That was just between us," she screamed. "You weren't supposed to throw that in my face like this. You weren't supposed to humiliate me in front of them." My father's voice cut through the room, low and heavy. "Is this true, Rebecca?" She whirled toward him, her voice breaking. "I only did it for my business, for the family, for the kids." Charlotte knew it was a risk. She never really expected me to pay her back. I clenched my fists, my chest burning. "Don't you dare twist this. You begged me. You promised me. And I believed you." The room dissolved into chaos. Margaret sobbing. Rebecca wailing. Richard staring at the papers like they were burning his hands. And then from the doorway, a calm voice cut through the noise. "She's lying." We all turned. Michael stepped inside, his face grim, his coat still damp from the rain outside. His eyes locked on Rebecca. "You never told them the truth, did you? That Daniel used most of that money to pay off his gambling debts?" The blood drained from Rebecca's face. "Stop it!" she hissed, her tears turning to rage. "You don't know what you're talking about." Michael didn't flinch. "Yes, I do. I covered for him more than once. I know exactly where the money went." I turned to Daniel. He sat rigid on the edge of the couch, his skin pale, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. His hands shook violently, gripping his knees. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady now. "Tell them." He lifted his head slowly, his eyes hollow, his lips parted as if the words were stuck in his throat. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, his shoulders sagged, and he lowered his gaze to the floor. "Yes," he whispered, barely audible. "It's true." Margaret let out a cry, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard's eyes widened, his face flushing red as he looked from Daniel to Rebecca. Rebecca's sobs turned shrill, frantic. She lunged at Daniel, her voice raw. "Why would you admit that you're ruining us?" But it was too late. The truth hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. I stood there, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. The document still lay on the table, the gold notary seal gleaming in the cold light. For years, I had been painted as the selfish one, the ungrateful daughter. But now at last the cracks were spreading in the story they had built around me. And Daniel's confession was only the beginning. Daniel's voice cracked the silence like glass shattering. He gripped his knees so tightly his knuckles were white. His head bowed as though he couldn't bear the weight of his own words. "I owe $60,000, he whispered. His shoulders shook. $60,000. At the casino in Tacoma. I can't pay it back." The room froze. For a moment, no one even breathed. The numbers echoed in my head, too large, too devastating to absorb all at once. Richard's face went pale, then red, his chest heaving as though the air itself betrayed him. 60,000! His voice thundered, shaking the walls. "You mean to tell me, my daughter begged for money because you buried yourself in debt like some—" His words choked off, swallowed by fury. Margaret swayed where she stood, one hand gripping the back of a chair. "No!" she gasped, her voice high and trembling. "No, this can't be true." But Daniel wasn't finished. His confession spilled out in broken fragments. It wasn't just the casino. Rebecca. His eyes darted toward her before falling back to the carpet. Rebecca opened credit cards in Margaret's name, 3 of them. Maxed out. Over $20,000. My mother's knees buckled. She collapsed against the chair, her face ghostly. I rushed forward, instinctively catching her just before she slid to the floor. Her body was limp in my arms, her lips whispering prayers too faint to hear. Richard shot to his feet, the papers on the table scattering. "You what?" His voice shook with disbelief. His eyes blazed at Rebecca. "You used your mother's name." Rebecca's sobs came fast and desperate. "It wasn't like that. I had no choice. Daniel was drowning. I had to save us." She pointed a trembling finger at him. "This is his fault. He made me do it. I only wanted to protect the family." Daniel's head jerked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Don't you dare put this all on me. You took from your father, too." The words hit harder than any scream. My stomach clenched, a cold dread seeping into my veins. "What do you mean?" I demanded, though I already feared the answer. Daniel's voice broke. She pulled $40,000 from Richard's 401k. Said she'd put it back when things turned around. Richard staggered backward as though struck. He clutched the edge of the mantel for balance, his hand trembling violently. His face drained of all color. "My retirement," he rasped. You stole my retirement." Rebecca shook her head furiously, tears streaming down her blotchy face. "I was going to fix it. I just needed time. I was trying to hold everything together." "Hold everything together!" Richard roared. "You've ripped this family apart." The air in the room grew suffocating, the truth unraveling like a noose tightening around every neck. Margaret stirred weakly in my arms, her eyelids fluttering as if she might faint again. And then Daniel broke completely. His voice rose, strangled with terror. "If we don't pay it back, they'll come. Do you understand? They'll come to the house." He pressed his hands over his face, rocking forward, his sobs muffled but raw. "They'll find me. They'll find all of us." A chill shot through me, deeper than anger, deeper than grief. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was danger, real and immediate, crawling into the walls of my parents' home. The chandelier flickered overhead, the sound of Daniel's weeping filling the room, and for the first time I saw fear spread across my father's face. Not fear of shame, not fear of judgment, but fear for his life, for all our lives. The room, once heavy with accusation, now pulsed with dread. And I knew in that moment that nothing in this family would ever be the same again. By the end of that week, whispers had seeped past the walls of my parents' house and into every corner of the community. It started as murmurs in the church lobby after Sunday service, a few exchanged looks, a hand covering a mouth. But soon the whispers grew into rumors, and the rumors turned into questions that followed me like shadows. At my office downtown, I felt it before anyone even spoke. My assistant avoided my eyes, her usual cheerful good morning replaced with a quiet nod. Clients who normally greeted me with firm handshakes now hesitated, their smiles tight. During a tax consultation, one longtime client leaned back in his chair, his tone too casual. "You know, Charlotte, people are saying your sister's in some financial trouble." Strange how stories spread, isn't it? I kept my expression neutral, though, inside my stomach twisted. "Rumors tend to grow legs," I said, returning to the paperwork in front of us. But my hands felt stiff, my pen too heavy. Later that afternoon, another client lingered after our meeting, lowering her voice. "I just want to make sure your firm's reputation isn't tied up in anything messy. I can't afford bad publicity." Her words stung. I forced a smile, though my throat burned. "You can trust me," I said simply. She left unconvinced, her heels clicking against the tile like a gavel. I sat frozen at my desk after she left, staring at the city skyline through the window. My practice had been built on precision, trust, and years of tireless work. Now, in a matter of days, Rebecca's chaos threatened to unravel it all. The door opened, and Susan walked in. She carried her leather briefcase, and the kind of confidence that made rooms feel safer. "You look like hell," she said bluntly, dropping into the chair across from me. I let out a humorless laugh. "Thanks. I've had better weeks." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I've heard the chatter. Clients, neighbors, even at the courthouse. But listen to me, Charlotte. This isn't on you. People want gossip, and Rebecca handed it to them on a silver platter. You've done nothing wrong." I rubbed my temples, exhaustion tugging at me. "Tell that to the clients who suddenly wonder if I'm part of some scam. Tell that to the church women whispering after service. They don't care about the truth, Susan. They care about the story." Susan's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. "Then we control the narrative. You keep doing your work, keep showing up. I'll handle the rest. Anyone who tries to smear your reputation professionally will hear from me first." Her words steadied me more than I expected. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of protection, a reminder that I wasn't standing entirely alone. Still outside my office walls, the storm only grew. At church, people I had known since childhood averted their eyes or offered stiff nods instead of warm greetings. I overheard conversations cut short when I walked past, voices dropping to whispers. The Hayes family, once held up as respectable, was now a subject of pity and disdain. And it wasn't just me. Rebecca couldn't step into the grocery store without drawing stares. Neighbors who used to wave across their porches now closed their blinds when she walked by. I heard through mutual acquaintances that her friends from the church committee stopped inviting her to luncheons. One even suggested publicly that she should step down at least until things are resolved. But the worst was what it did to Tyler and Emma. One evening, Margaret called me in tears. "Charlotte, the children are being teased at school," she sobbed. "Their classmates are saying awful things. Tyler came home crying, saying someone called him a thief's son. Emma doesn't want to go back tomorrow." My chest clenched, anger surging. I wanted to comfort them, to shield them, but I also knew exactly why it was happening. Rebecca and Daniel had dragged their children into the wreckage, and now they were paying the price for sins they hadn't committed. When I saw Tyler and Emma later that week, their usual bright chatter was muted. Tyler clung to my hand, his small voice breaking. "Aunt Charlotte, why are people saying bad things about us? Did we do something wrong?" I crouched down, meeting his wide, fearful eyes. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault." Emma pressed her face into my shoulder, her tiny body trembling. I held them both close, my throat thick, wishing I could absorb their pain and erase it. The truth was spreading faster than we could contain it, and with every revelation, the walls of our family's carefully crafted image crumbled further. I stood in my apartment that night, staring out at the darkened city streets. The glow of neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, and for the first time I felt the full collapse of something I had once thought unshakable. The Hayes name. Our family's reputation, our place in the community, was in ruins. And Rebecca, who had always thrived on sympathy, was now finding no one left to stand beside her. Even the women who once gushed over her at church now looked at her with narrowed eyes, their whispers no longer laced with pity, but with disdain. It struck me then with a clarity that almost hurt the foundation had cracked. The house of cards she had built, propped up by my parents' favoritism and Daniel's lies, was tumbling down, and for the first time I wasn't the one being buried beneath it. The dining room was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. A few cousins sat stiffly along the wall. Neighbors from across the street had been invited under the guise of support, and the silence before my father spoke was like the pause before a gavel strikes. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face drawn but determined, his hands folded on the polished oak, as though he were opening court. "This is it," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Our last family meeting on this matter." His eyes swept the room, finally locking on me. "Charlotte, if you don't pay the $50,000 for your sister's wedding, you will be erased from this family. Erased from our lives. From our name. Forever." No gasp came from me this time. No surge of panic or heat rushing to my cheeks. I simply sat still, spine straight, hands folded calmly in my lap. I could feel all the eyes on me. The neighbors waiting for a spectacle, the cousins shifting uncomfortably, Margaret wringing her hands at Richard's side, Rebecca already trembling in rehearsed sobs. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "I have helped enough. More than enough. I owe you nothing further. I will not give you $50,000. Rebecca let out a wail that seemed to shake the chandelier overhead. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders jerking dramatically. "She's destroying me. She wants to see me humiliated in front of everyone." Margaret reached for me, her voice cracking. "Please, Charlotte, think of your sister. Think of the children. Don't let their memory of this wedding be shame. You've always been so strong, so capable. Use that strength for them just this once more." I turned to her, my chest tight, but my resolve sharper. "I have been using my strength for this family my whole life, Mom. And every time it's been erased as if it never happened. This is not my burden to carry." Richard's face darkened. His jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck stood out. He slammed his palm on the table, making glasses rattle and a few cousins flinch. "Do you want the neighbors to hear that my daughter refuses to support her family? Do you want them to see the shame you bring us around us?" The neighbors shifted their silence louder than words. I saw one of them exchange a look, saw another lean back, as if uncomfortable with the theater unraveling before them. The weight of judgment Richard was so afraid of had already shifted, but not onto me. Rebecca threw herself to her knees, crawling toward me, clutching at the hem of my skirt. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her voice shrill. "Please, Charlotte, please, I can't lose this. You'll regret it if you let me fall apart like this." I stood slowly, pushing my chair back. The scrape of wood on wood cut through her sobs. And my purse hung from the back of the chair, and I slung it over my shoulder with deliberate calm. My heart pounded in my chest, but my hands didn't shake this time. "I don't regret telling the truth," I said evenly. My voice filled the room, carrying over Rebecca's theatrics. Margaret's pleading eyes, Richard's burning glare. "I regret nothing. Except that it took me this long to finally say no." Rebecca's sobs grew higher, bordering on hysteria. Margaret's hands clasped together as if in prayer, whispering under her breath. Richard stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his face red with a mix of fury and humiliation. The cousins stayed silent, unwilling to interfere. The neighbors who had come to witness sat frozen, their expressions tight with discomfort. Their presence meant to shame me into submission, instead amplified the hollowness of the threats being thrown at me. I took a step toward the doorway, my heels clicking against the hardwood. Rebecca lunged after me, but Margaret caught her arm, whispering frantically. Richard's voice followed me, low and seething, the final arrow in his quiver. "If you walk out that door, you are no daughter of mine. Don't you dare come back." I paused only long enough to breathe the silence stretching taut. Then I opened the door. The cool evening air spilled in, brushing against my skin like a release. Without looking back, I stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud, sealing the moment like a final sentence written in stone. For the first time, the weight on my shoulders lifted. Not gone, but shifted, leaving me standing alone on the porch in the quiet night, free and trembling all at once. 6 months later, the air above Lake Union smelled of salt and pine crisp in the early evening. I leaned on the railing of my new condo's balcony, the city lights glittering off the water. For the first time in years, the view felt like it belonged to me. Not borrowed, not conditional, not tied to anyone else's demands. Behind me, laughter rang out. Tyler and Emma darted through the living room, their socks sliding on the hardwood floors as they chased each other with toy airplanes. Their giggles filled the apartment, echoing off the walls that were no longer silent, no longer heavy with guilt. Emma ran up and tugged at my sleeve. "Aunt Charlotte, come see the fort we made?" I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll be there in a minute, sweetheart." She scampered off, Tyler following close behind, their joy spilling out like sunlight. Rebecca was nowhere to be seen. Word had spread quickly after everything came out. The church committee asked her to step down from her volunteer groups. Her closest friends stopped answering her calls. By the end of winter, she had moved into a cramped apartment near Rainier Avenue, paint peeling from the walls, her once busy phone silent. For someone who had lived on attention and sympathy, the quiet was her own private exile. Daniel had fared worse. The court limited his custody after his gambling debts caught up to him, granting him only supervised visits. He showed up in court looking worn down, his jacket too loose on his shoulders, his hands trembling when the judge listed the restrictions. I sat in the back not to gloat, but because Tyler and Emma deserved someone steady in the room. Daniel avoided my eyes as if facing me would force him to face what he had done. Richard and Margaret, once so loud in their disapproval, had fallen quiet. The phone calls demanding obedience stopped. Instead, on holidays, a simple card would arrive. No money, no warm notes, just their names scrawled at the bottom. I kept them in a drawer, unsure if they were apologies or placeholders for something they could never say. Susan stood beside me on the balcony, now holding 2 glasses of wine. She clinked hers gently against mine. "To boundaries," she said with a half smile, her eyes steady. I lifted my glass, the rim catching the city lights, to finally learning how to say no. We sipped in silence for a moment, the hum of traffic below mingling with the sound of children's laughter drifting through the sliding doors. Inside, Emma had taped a crayon drawing to my fridge, 3 stick figures holding hands smiling. She had written in crooked letters, "Me plus Tyler plus Aunt Charlotte." Every time I looked at it, I felt something inside me heal a little more. I thought back on the long road that had brought me here, the late nights of doubt, the tears I hid in the dark, the weight of being told love came with a price tag. I remembered the sound of my father's hand slamming on the table, the sting of Rebecca's accusations, the chorus of voices calling me selfish. And yet I also remembered the steady calm of holding that notarized paper in my hands, the moment Mrs. Thompson spoke up at church, the strength I found in finally walking away. My voice carried softly into the night, though it was meant for more than just the empty air. Family isn't supposed to drain you until there's nothing left. Family isn't supposed to measure your worth in dollars or guilt. Real family is the people who respect your boundaries, who value you for who you are, not what you can give. I looked back inside where Tyler and Emma had collapsed on the couch in a heap of blankets, their laughter giving way to sleepy yawns. They were the proof that love didn't need to come with conditions. Turning to Susan, I smiled faintly. I used to think saying no meant I was ungrateful, that I was cold, but now I know it's the only way I could finally breathe. The city shimmered before me, alive and unrelenting, but instead of feeling small, I felt grounded, steady. This was my life now. No longer bound by threats or ultimatums, no longer someone's scapegoat or ATM. It was mine. And to those listening, those who've carried the same weight, I want to ask you something. What boundaries have you had to set with your family to protect yourself? Share your story. Because sometimes the act of saying no is the first step toward finally being free.